Daf Pei Hey Amud Beis will begin Pei Hey Amud Aleph, 3 lines from the bottom. We were discussing the Mishnah that as far as Kalaim is concerned, one is able to plant in a standard patch, which is 6 by 6 Tvachim, not including the Tefach walkway around the perimeter. The standard Aruga is 6 by 6 Tvachim, so one can plant 5 different Zroim. He leaves the corners empty. You can plant one row here, down here, leaving the corners empty, another row here, that's 4, and one in the middle. Rav said this is only Aruga, it's only Aruga Bechur B'Shinyan, when there are no other patches around, because if there are other patches around, then you'll have them, the plantings will be side by side with a separation of only 2 Tvachim and not 3 Tvachim. So it has to be that there's one patch that stands on its own. There's nothing surrounding it. It's in a churba. It's in an area where there's nothing planted around it, because if there were plantings around it, then you'd have different rows that are side by side. Vad fragt the Gemara, va'ika makom kronis. Well, why do you have to say that it's bechurba? Why can you not plant it and plant the corners, but plant the corners one way and then don't plant the other corner, and then plant down here on this way? So you're planting, for instance, here and here. Then this area here is blank. On the aruga that's next to it, you do the reverse. You plant down here, so they're not side by side, and then you plant over here. So you stagger it in each way so that there's no parallel, you do not have parallel rows. You stagger it, and you plant here, and the next one you plant not here, but you plant here. So you don't have, and you can plant the whole patch and several arugas in doing it in a staggered fashion, and you don't have rows that are parallel to each other. So Amri Beirav Shmei Derav, it says Amri Beirav Shmei Derav B'Malas Akronis. What we're talking about is he's Memala the Kronis, that he plants straight up. He does not leave the corners empty. He plants straight up. So the configuration in the Mishnah, according to Rav, is that you plant 1 and you plant 2. So you're planting it straight up. Then you plant over here in the middle and over here. So you're leaving the areas here. Now, if you have a row that's planted straight, or malachronis, then if you plant another area here, you'll have parallel rows, which is an Eruvian, which is Kalaim. So therefore, and that's why he says it has to be Bechurba, where there's nothing next to it, because since we're talking of the configuration is you're planting the rows from one end to the other. In the middle, you don't. You just plant in the middle section without planting it to the end. But on the sides, you're planting it one end to the other. If you had another aruga, then you would be planting it. If you had another aruga, you'd be planting 2 parallel rows. So it has to be bechurba. Well, what's forcing Rav to say that? Why don't you say it's the way, the configuration that we discussed previously, where he's not planting from one end to the other, where he's not mimala the kronis? Why don't you say it's talking the configuration that we mentioned before, where he only plants on part of the area and not the entire side of it, and he staggers it? So what's forcing to say that? Where it's geyser that if we allow you to do it in a staggered fashion, we're afraid that a person will forget, and he will plant it from one end to the other, and then it'll come out to be a kalayim with the patch that's next door. So therefore, we don't allow him to do it in a staggered way, because we are afraid that he'll forget. He'll plant straight up, and then he'll have the kalayim the erbuvia will be kilayim. Frag the Gemara, v'lo yel rosh tar yerek. Well, why should we be geyser? We see that there's this halacha of a rosh tar of a yerek, meaning if you have that one patch comes into another patch. Now, rosh tar is called the tip of it. Normally, the fields, as Rashi explains, they were planted. They had the long furrows. But as it came to the end of the field, the furrows were shortened. They became shorter and shorter, and the end of the field came to a point. So if you have a rosh tar, which is a point, you have the large field, but at the end it comes to a point. This point, this triangle, if it extends into another field, so it's clear that you have separate fields because you have a triangle, you have the point that's coming into another field. So you have the rosh tar, the end of this planting, comes to the tip of this, comes into the square of the next field. It's clear that these are separate areas, separate fields, and it's not an erbuvia. So a rosh tar is mutter. So why should it be geyser over here in any event? Why should it be a geyser even if they are and do end up to be next to each other? Why shouldn't it be any less than a rosh tar, which is mutter, because they are distinct fields and it doesn't have the appearance of an erbuvia of kilayim. If the tip of the planting comes into another field, it's mutter because it's clear that this is the end of the field. So they're separate fields. More answers. Ain't rosh tar ba'aruga. That we say that the one that comes planting that comes into the other one is a rosh tar. It's not by a aruga. It's not by a patch. It's by a field. So if you have a field, the end of one field into another field, it's clear that they're distinct areas. But if you only have an aruga, we don't say rosh tar ba'aruga because it's not clear that these are distinct areas. It's only where there's a heker, where there's distinct separate fields, and that's indicated by a rosh tar. You have a field that's square, and then the end of another field comes to a tip and extends into it. It's clear that this is the end of this field and this is the beginning of another field. So there is no, there's not kilayim. But aruga, he says, he holds that we don't have this kula of a rosh tar, does not apply to an aruga. So that's the shita of Rav, in that the mission that we're talking about over here is bechorba. We're talking where it's an isolation, there's nothing else planted around it. Ushmul amar aruga ben aruga shanina. But Shmuel says no. We don't have to be talking in isolation. There's other patches planted around it, and it is planted in the manner that we discussed before. Frek demora I v'ha kamisar b'hadadi. Why don't you have taruvis? If you have the planting next to each other, you have parallel rows. Why isn't that erbuvia? Why isn't that kilayim? So we say, like we mentioned before in the Kasha on Rav, in B'nai to Shur Lakan, V'Shur Lakan, where they planted in a staggered fashion. Like was suggested earlier, it's planted in a staggered fashion so that you don't have parallel rows. You don't have rows that are parallel to each other and that are planted side by side. They're planted in the staggered fashion so that you don't have row next to row. Like we discussed before, they're planted one way this way, the other way is planted over here, it's planted down here, it's planted in a staggered fashion. So, and Shmuel says, and we're not concerned, we're not geyser, like Rav is geyser, Shmuel holds we're not geyser that he will fill up the corners. We're not geyser Shem Yamalas Akronis. We don't apply that gzer, so therefore Shmuel says in a staggered fashion it is mutter. Omer Ula, Boy Marova, the Hershel in Eretz Yisrael, if Kia Telemech al Panei Kula Mahu. What is the halacha if you take a row and you plant it al Panei Kula? So in the configuration that we had was in the Mishnah, you had planting in this way. You had your box, and you had one in the middle. He has a shaila, if you plant a row across here. Now there's different mahalochim in Taisus, but one mahalach is that he made a depth of a tafach. He made it deeper than the area here, the planting here. He made it deeper by a tafach that extends from one end to the other. Now the issue is that between the perimeter, you don't have a 3 tvachim. There's now less than 3 tvachim between the row that's planted here and this new row that you're planting across the middle. Now, do we say over here, well, they have 2 parallel rows, and therefore should be considered kilayim? Or perhaps we say that no, that this should be considered to be distinct. It's clear that this is a separate planting area. So that was his shaila. Omer of Sheishes Boyer Buva Bittul is ashur. He says it's considered a buvya. There, you don't have a separation of 3 tvachim. They're planted in parallel to each other, not perpendicular, so it does not look like a separate area. So he says it's an buvya, and therefore it's kilayim. Ravasi Amar ein irvu mevatel ashur. Ravasi says no, it's not mevatel ashur. They look distinct. They look like they are distinct separate areas. Esur Ravina Ravashi. He asked the following kasha: it says we learned that a person plants 2 rows of kishun, cucumbers. Shtei shuras shel deluin of gourds. Shtei shuras shel pula mitzri, Egyptian beans. Mutter, it's mutter. Since there's 2 rows, then they look distinct. It looks like separate areas. It doesn't look like interbuvia. It's mutter. But shura achas shel kishun, shura achas shel deluin, shura achas shel pula mitzri also. But if it's only 1 row, then it's also. So you see that 1 row, if it's parallel to another, if it doesn't have the harchaka, it's also. So over here, why are you matter? Even though it is a tefach, according to Taisus Pshat, even though it's a tefach deeper, you still say that 1 row parallel to each other is an erbuvia. More answers shiny hacha dika shracha. Over here, the reason why the 1 row in that case, by the case of Kishu and etc. and Dilun, is because they get intermingled. So the leaves grow large, it grows tall, then they get intermingled with each other. But in other types of planting, they don't have the high growth, and therefore it will be viewed as a distinct area. Amar Rav Kahana, Amar Rav Yaichner says, if a person wants to fill up his whole garden with yerek, he doesn't want to leave empty spaces. So the configuration that we had was most of the interior of the aruga is empty. You have a planting in the middle, you have plantings on the side. But if he wants to fill up, not 100%, not literally all of it, but most of it, if he wants to have it full with planting and he doesn't want to have the empty spaces, what does he do? He says that he has the standard patch with 6 tvachim by 6 tvachim, and he makes a circle. He plants in a circular area. So therefore, he is, with the exception of the spaces over here, but he makes a circle and he plants, and he can fill up this whole area with a planting. He can fill up that whole area with a planting, and just with the exception of the very corners, then he'll be able to then plant in that whole area, and he won't have a blank space. So he's and then he plants on the perimeter. And now, even though it says the karnoisa, which means the corners, we're not talking literally about the corners. We don't mean mamish literally the corners. It means he fills up the area with other plantings on. He can do plantings on the perimeters, and he can plant other mediums. So he has virtually everything is planted. The perimeter is planted. The corner is not. The perimeter, and the circle in the middle, which he now fills with another min. And therefore he's able to plant virtually all of the aruga. So, fractic more of Ika de Beni. What do you mean he has to How can he plant the whole area if he wants to be mala his whole gina? Well, if he has two patches and different arugas all over, now if he's going to plant the walkways, then he's not going to have any separation between the arugas. And he's not going to be plants the walkways. He's not going to have a separation between the arugas. How can he plant the walkways? We're talking about where he does not plant the walkways around the perimeter. In Hanami, when he said that original mouse kol ginosa yerek, he didn't mean literally that he can fill it entirely with planting. He didn't mean it literally. He meant just on a relative basis that, as opposed to the configuration that we had before, this fills up the aruga much more. It fills up the gina much more than the previous configuration. But in Hanami, he's not planting the walkways. That would be a problem with kilayim. And it just means not literally that the mamala kol ginosa, but he gains much more than the other configuration. But Rav Ashi Amar says no, it means virtually all of the gina. Now it's never 100% because in the circle there are the areas in the corner which are not planted, but and Rav Ashi says he means it virtually literally that it's all planted, because what do you do with the walkways? You could plant the walkways. Im hayazar and shesi zar erev zar and shesi. You plant the walkways with a different configuration and a different pattern than the aruga. So if aruga is planted this way, it's horizontal, then the walkways you plant vertically. So this is planted this way direction, this is planted horizontally, so it's clear that they're separate areas. So therefore, and then on the other side, if you have something on the other side of it, then also you plant it in a different configuration. So the aruga, if the walkway over here is planted this way, then you plant this one this way. So you always plant it, this is vertical, this is horizontal. So you're always planting it in a different direction, and therefore it's not an abuvia. So you could plant virtually the whole gina if you do it in that manner, where in the center is a circle, and you plant the perimeters. You don't fill up the mamish, the corners. You leave the very corners empty. And the perimeter you plant, but you plant the perimeter in alternate directions. The work area of planting Yerokas, if you're planting with other vegetables, is 6 tefachim. And you look at it like a square board, meaning in order to facilitate planting of different types of zroim, the aruga has to be like a square board. Now, according to this suggestion that we just had, is you're planting in a circle. You're planting in a circle. Rav Yochanan says you're mamal the gina with the yerek by planting in a circle. But we see over here that to be able to allow planting with other minim, it has to be square. A circle will not allow you to plant other minim. So it's ketavla merubas, ketavla hu deshari. It's a ketavla hu deshari. Ha lav hachi also, but if it's not a tavla, if it's not square, it's a circle, it'll be also. The more answer is halsam la kul by kul achrina. Now over there, it doesn't mean that unless it's a tavla merubas, you cannot plant any other minim. It means what we're referring to over there is in order to be matir an additional kula, which was not contemplated by Rav Yochanan, there it has to be ketavla. What is that kula? Lahati rosh Torah yaitse minim. That is to be matir a rosh Torah. That, like the case we discussed before, if you have the tip of one field into another field, since it's a tip, it comes into a point, it's clear that they are separate fields, and therefore you don't need to have a separation, and it's not erbuvia, there's no kilayim. Now, to allow this kul of a rosh Torah, having one field come into another, therefore it has to be square. If it's not square, there's not that distinction between the areas. So it has to be that there's a square area, and one tip comes of one into the other. So Rashi points out that we just mentioned earlier is that Rav holds that there's no rosh Torah by an aruga. Rosh Torah is only by a soda. So Rashi says either Rav Yochanan argues on that, or what we're talking about is that there is a Rosh Torah of the aruga into another field, not from aruga to aruga. But in any event, this, what it's referring to over here, that it says it has to be Katav L'Murabas, that's only for the heter, for the kula of a Rosh Torah. That if there's a tip of one coming into the other, one field into the other, or one aruga into a field, or one aruga, perhaps one aruga into another aruga, if we say that Rav Yochanan does not hold like Rav, then that's only if the aruga is square. If it's square and then you have a tip of another one, it's clear that they're distinct areas. But if they're not square, then you don't have that distinction. We're not mater and not maker with the Rosh Tar. But as far as planting other zroim, other minim, Rav Yochanan holds it does not have to be square, and therefore you can plant in a circular pattern. And then it's clear that if one is planted, one min is in the circle, and the other ones are planted horizontally or vertically, that it's not erbuvia, they're separate plantings, and it would be mutter.